Welcome to graphing trig functions. We're going to pick up where we left off yesterday and go to example 5 in your packet. First, we're going to look at the function that says negative sine, and that tells us that we're going to start at the midline and go down. So in the end, our graph should look something like this. Your midline is 0 because there is no vertical shift, and just remember to include the y equals. Your amplitude is the number in front of the trig function, which in this case is 1. Remember, it's always positive, so it is not negative 1. Your maximum is your midline plus your amplitude. So that's going to be 0 plus 1, which gives us a maximum value of 1. And our minimum is your midline minus your amplitude. And that's going to give us 0 minus 1, which is a minimum of negative 1. Your frequency is found in front of the x variable. In this case, that's 2. So it's saying that there's 2 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. Your period is 2 pi over your frequency, which in this case is 2 pi over 2. So our period is just pi. The quarter points are your period divided by 4. So we have our first quarter point is pi over 4. That means the next quarter point is 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4. And notice how 4 pi over 4 reduces to just pi, which was your period. So your final quarter point and the period should always be equivalent. You're going to go to the graph and label everything. So we have 0, 1, negative 1. And if you think that's too smushed in, what you can do is count by 2s instead. That way maybe it's a little more spread out. So how about we do 0, 1 up 2 boxes and negative 1 down 2 boxes. And we're going to spread out our quarter points as well. We're going to start at the midline, and our midline is at y equals 0. So I'm going to put a dashed line there. And our first point is going to be on the y-axis at the midline. Because it's negative, I'm going to head downwards to my minimum, come back to your midline, go up to your maximum, and come back to your midline. And connect everything with a nice round curve. Let's try the next one. You have a cosine curve that is positive. So positive cosine, you have to remember this, that it starts at the max. That means your graph overall should resemble the shape. Your midline is your vertical shift, what you're adding or subtracting to the fraction. So in this case, we have, not fraction, the equation. In this case, we have y equals 1. Your amplitude, the number in front of the trig function, is 2. It's your vertical stretch, how much you're multiplying the equation by. Your maximum is the midline plus the amplitude to get a max value of 3. And if you start at the midline and if you go down by 2, you get a minimum of negative 1. frequency is the number in front of the x variable, which is 1 in this case. So your period, 2 pi over the frequency, is just 2 pi. That means your first quarter point, your period divided by 4, is going to simplify to pi over 2. So your quarter points are going to go pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2. And again, 4 pi over 2 reduces to 2 pi, which was your period. Label everything on your graph. We have 3, our midline's at 1, and our minimum's at -1. So since it's a cosine curve, we're going to start at the top at 3. Now, please make sure you're not going to go to the x-axis because in this case your midline is at 1, and it'll help you if you draw it in. So our next point is going to be at pi over 2, and it's going to be at the midline at 1. Your next quarter point goes to the minimum, you come back to the midline, and you end back up top. Please remember that you don't go from a max to a minimum without crossing over your midline first. When you connect this, please don't do a U because that's not the shape of a cosine curve. It has kind of like a fanned out U. It opens upwards at the top. Why don't you try doing this one on your own and finding out all the information? Even though they don't list everything, you have to find every piece on your own and you need to remember what you have to find. Because this one's a positive cosine curve, you're going to start at the max. The first thing you should always be finding is your midline, which in this case, that vertical shift is y equals 1. The next thing you want is your amplitude, which is the number in front of the function, 3. So that means your max is your midline 1 plus 3. We're going up to 4. And if you subtract 1 minus 3, we are going down to -2. Your frequency in front of the x value is 2. So that means your period, which is 2 pi over the frequency, simplifies to just pi. Your quarter points, your period divided by 4 will be pi over 4. So we have pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4. Now, this graph doesn't have an x-axis. You could draw it in wherever you want. Sometimes you can draw it in the middle, sometimes you need more space, and you would have to draw it either towards the top or the bottom of your graph. You want to make sure we could fit in a maximum value of 4 and a minimum value of -2. In this case, if you draw it in the middle, everything will be fine. We'll be able to get everything on the graph. So I'm going to draw in my x-axis. And then I'm going to continue on with labeling everything. I have my midline at 1, my max at 4, and my minimum at -2. And then your quarter points. In this case, if you count by 3, you'll go off the edge, so now we have to start counting by 2's. You're going to draw in your midline since it's not at the x-axis. So draw in that midline at y equals 1. And we're going to start at the maximum value of 4 since it's a positive cosine curve. You're going to go to your middle, the bottom, back to the middle, and to the top. And connect it. You should try this one on your own and then see at the end, do you get the right answer? You can watch the entire explanation or just fast forward to the end. In this case, you have a negative sine curve. So negative sine starts at the midline and goes down. From there, your midline is y equals -3 because we shifted down in this case. Your amplitude is a positive value of 4. The number in front of x is your frequency, so we have a frequency of 1, which means your period, 2 pi over the frequency, is just 2 pi. And your quarter points, when you divide the period by 4, you get your first quarter point is pi over 2. And I know this problem keeps coming up a lot with the same quarter points. Eventually, you'll just remember them, or you can solve for it each and every time. Once you have all your information, you're going to label your graph. We want to go down to -3, and sorry, that a -3 is our midline. We didn't find the max or min, so we have to find that as well. Your maximum value is going to be -3 plus 4 to be a maximum value of 1. And your minimum value is going to be -3 minus 4. So we need to go down to -7. So in your head, you should be playing around with it of where do you have to put all these labels to make sure you include your max of 1 and your minimum of -7. If your graph goes down to -8, you can kind of work backwards to figure it out where all your values are going to be. So in this case, we are going to draw our x-axis way up here. And then you can continue labeling your quarter points of pi over 2 and so on. Draw in your midline at -3. And start graphing. Because it's sine, you are starting at the midline. And the negative tells us to go down to our minimum first. Go back to your midline, up to your maximum value, and back to your midline. Let's try one more together. So positive sine starts at the midline. But because it's positive, this time we're going to go up. Your midline is going to be y equals -1 because you're shifting down and subtracting 1 at the end. Your amplitude is found in front of the sine, which is 2. So your max, if you're starting at -1 and you're going up by 2, you go up to a +1. And if you're starting at -1 and you're going down by 2, you go down to -3. Your frequency is 2 because of the 2x. Your period is 2 pi over that frequency. And if your period is pi, that means your quarter points is going to start with pi over 4. Figure out where to put your x-axis in. That way you can include your maximum of 1 and your minimum of -3. You can just put it in the middle in this case and label everything. You have your midline at -1, your max at +1, and your minimum at -3. Sketch in your midline at -1. And we're going to start at the midline because it's sine. Because it's positive sine, your next quarter point is going to be at the max, back to the midline, down to the bottom, and back to your midline. And there you have it. You have so many practice examples on graphing trig functions. Make sure that you know every single piece of information that you have to find and where you have to find it in the equation. And that's all for this video.